Prior to being married, I was dating my wife, and we began to be sexually active and using contraception. So I was not part of the church's faithful at that point. I was part of the church, but I wasn't part of the faithful. So remember when we did get married, and after having our 2 children, my wife wanted to stop, and she wanted to have her tubes tied. And though I wasn't terribly in favor of the idea, I wanted more children. I remember her mother calling, who was a very strong, faithful Catholic, and telling her that this is wrong. You know that this is wrong. Margie, like most of us at that time, was like, what authority do parents have? Don't trust anybody over 30 was the motto. And what authority does the church have? And I actually defended Margie in that place and supported her decision. So I was very much a part of the culture, even though I was a practicing Catholic. I was very much a part of the culture, kind of throwing off anything that didn't make sense to us in our own minds. And some of it was done out of selfishness, and some of it was done out of rebellion. But we thought in that we were just deciding for ourselves and not letting anybody else choose for us. I could see the effect in our relationship of having made that choice, which I didn't anticipate. I really didn't anticipate that. But then later on, I began to study the theology of the body, John Paul II's theology of the body, and began to see and understand all of it very differently. And then probably a crucial point was listening to Janet Smith's talk, Contraception, Why Not? And when I heard that, in light of the theology of the body, it was just like this very clear, oh man, I was already in a gradual process of conversion, but it was like, that was all. I was just totally deluded at that point. And then I read Humanae Vitae. At that point, it was like, I need to read this for myself. And when I read it, it was a prophetic vision of what was going to happen in society over the next several years that I lived through. I mean, we all lived through. And every word of it, I said, this is truth. And in our arrogance, in my personal arrogance, and my personal desire to be my own authority, I was throwing off the truth. I was throwing off what was for my good, for the good of families and everybody else. You can't approach your sexuality in a vacuum apart from the spiritual life. The two are not separated. God, from the very beginning, didn't separate our sexuality from our spiritual life. And yet, in that arrogance, in that, kind of like, I'm going to decide for myself, there's a blindness. There's a sense that I can do whatever I want to do in the areas of our sexuality, and my faith life is over here. And not realizing how foolish that was. And what I began to realize is the separation from God that created without knowing it, And then the separation that happens in a marriage when you close the Holy Spirit out from that most vital part of your relationship. And then I began to see it in all the couples that I counseled. Once I saw it for myself, I could see it for all the couples that I was counseling. It was just like so obvious afterwards. People typically tend to think of the church as wanting to repress our sexuality, wanting to stifle our sexual expression, and wanting to somehow make us narrow and conform to an ideal that doesn't bring us happiness. And it's actually the opposite is true. The beauty of the theology of the body is it creates a vision of the beauty of sexuality, and the beauty of marriage, the beauty of relationship, and the beauty of our identity as male and female. And when my daughters saw that, and again, they weren't active in their faith at this point, they were just growing back, they were just coming back. And when they saw that, they got turned on to their faith and to a vision for who they were as women, of what life was like, what marriage was like. It was a complete shift. And that shift was one of desire. It's like, I want to live like this. I think that the thing that I hear more than anything else when I was counseling, and even now when we're doing marriage conferences, is how many people feel used sexually. How many married people feel used sexually. And I saw it a lot with people having sex outside of marriage, but I was surprised at how many people felt used sexually in marriage. And it's, again, this same mentality, this mentality of sexuality is for my personal pleasure, and sexuality should be available to me anytime I want. And that's a lot of the rationale that I used when I was using contraception, and I know that many in the culture, many of the people that I meet, many in the church have that same. But the effect of that is that there's a using. And as people get used, they lose interest in sex. And as they lose interest in sex, it creates more marital problems. Sexual intimacy is meant to be a fulfillment emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And when people feel used, they lose interest, they begin to emotionally and spiritually and physically separate from each other, and then there's this distance that's created. And the beauty of the teaching is it talks about, and actually you see it happen in practice, it actually builds an intimacy at all three levels. And then sexual passion actually increases rather than decreases. And the fear is that it's going to decrease my sexual passion, it's going to decrease the intimacy that we experience, and actually the opposite happens.